Good evening, everyone. Great crowd tonight. My name is Phil Martin. I'm the chair of the Department of Kinesiology, and I'm pleased to welcome our department's annual Pease Family Scholar Lecture. Clearly, the Pease Lecture is one of the major highlights for our department each year. This is the 18th year of the lecture series, and we've had 21 guest speakers during that period of time. We're here tonight because of the generosity of Dean and Sally Pease and their lasting commitment to the department and to Iowa State University. Professor Dean Pease was a longtime faculty member in our department, and he was the department chair from 1987 until 1990. Prior to his untimely death in 1994, Dean and Sally established an endowment fund in memory of Dean's parents. Dean and Sally chose to direct a portion of his parents' charitable trust to 3 specific programs to benefit students and faculty at Iowa State in perpetuity. The greatest portion of the Pease contribution was used to create a Scholar in Residence program for the department. The annual earnings from this endowment allow the department to bring a leading scholar to campus to interact with faculty and students, and, of course, for this public lecture, the Pease Family Scholar Lecture. I'm very pleased to introduce this year's Pease Family Scholar. Dr. Adele Diamond is a Canada Research Chair Tier 1 Professor of Developmental Cognitive Psychology, the head of the program in Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience, and a member of the Brain Research Center, the Human Early Learning Partnership, and the Neuroscience and Cognitive Science programs at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Dr. Diamond has a stellar set of academic credentials that set the foundation for her highly interdisciplinary research interests and expertise. She received her BA from Swarthmore in psychology and sociology and anthropology. She earned her PhD from Harvard in developmental psychology, and then completed a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship in neuroanatomy at the Yale School of Medicine. Prior to moving to the University of British Columbia, Dr. Diamond held faculty appointments at MIT, Harvard, and Yale. Professor Diamond and her colleagues integrate developmental, cognitive science, neuroscience, and molecular genetic methods to study the part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that controls core mental processes and complex cognitive abilities that are crucial for problem solving, negotiation, creativity, and reasoning, and for success in all of life's aspects. Most recently, Professor Diamond has turned her attention to the possible roles of music, dance, storytelling, and physical activity in improving executive functions, academic outcomes, and mental health. Dr. Diamond's research has received substantial and consistent external governmental support since she was a graduate student. She's given many invited presentations throughout the world to audiences as diverse as neurologists, educators, lawyers, psychoanalysts, geneticists, parents, and the Dalai Lama. In 2009 alone, she was invited to speak in Australia, Brazil, the United Kingdom, Bulgaria, India, Russia, Spain, and throughout North America. Her work has appeared in top journals, such as Science, and has been highlighted in TV programs, documentaries, radio programs, textbooks, newspapers, and magazines. In fact, today I think she had 2 interviews with news media individuals. She's been the recipient of numerous awards and honors. She's a fellow in the Royal Society of Canada, the American Psychological Association in both developmental psychology and behavioral neuroscience, and of the American Association for Psychological Science. She was named one of the 2,000 Outstanding Women of the 20th Century, a distinguished scientific lecturer by the American Psychological Association, and a Woman of Distinction by the YWCA. I could continue to highlight Dr. Diamond's many accomplishments for a considerable amount of time. Suffice it to say that Dr. Diamond is highly accomplished and well recognized as one of the world's leading scholars in developmental cognitive psychology. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Adele Diamond as the 2012-13 Pease Family Scholar. The title of her presentation tonight is Benefits of Exercise for Success in School and Career. How important are the social, emotional, and cognitive aspects of physical activity for these benefits? Please help me welcome Dr. Diamond.
It's hard to follow an introduction like that. Thank you very much. Evidence shows that physical activity, especially aerobic exercise, robustly improves cognition and brain function, and in particular, the frontal lobe and executive functions that depend on the frontal lobe. And they show the largest benefit from improved fitness. The positive effects of aerobic physical activity on cognition and brain function are evident at the molecular, cellular, systems, and behavioral levels. And that's from a review done in 2008. There have been several reviews since then. For example, exercise, brain, and cognition across the lifespan. And the reviews continue to affirm the same conclusions. They just give more mechanisms for how this is happening. Though many studies have found aerobic exercise improves prefrontal cortex function and executive functions, all but 3 of those studies have either been done with adults or examined the effects of a single bout of aerobic exercise, where benefits may be transient. In general, the studies with children have not found the same strong benefits from aerobic exercise. Exercise alone appears not to be as effective in improving executive functions, at least in children, as exercise plus character development, for example, traditional martial arts, or exercise plus mindfulness, for example, yoga. Traditional martial arts emphasize self-control, discipline, and character development. So traditional martial arts teach that you should show respect, that you should be humble, that you need to exercise the self-control to wait until you have the opportunity to do something to your advantage. Don't immediately go on the attack. Wait for the other person to give you an opportunity to be slightly off balance, and then you go in. Perhaps the other person was about to attack you and now is slightly off balance, and then you go in and take advantage of that. So you need to exercise self-control, inhibition, so that you wait. In a study with adolescent juvenile delinquents, one group was assigned to traditional Taekwondo, emphasizing qualities such as respect, humility, responsibility, perseverance, and emphasizing the character development as much as the physical conditioning. And of course, emphasizing that you wait, just like I mentioned. The other group was assigned to modern martial arts, which was all about the physical. Nothing about character development, just about the physical activity, and just go in and attack. You don't have to wait. Those in traditional Taekwondo showed less aggression and anxiety and improved in social ability and self-esteem. But those in modern martial arts showed more juvenile delinquency and aggressiveness and decreased self-esteem and social ability. So I've been talking a little bit about executive functions. I thought I would just talk a little bit about what executive functions are. The executive functions refers to a cluster, a family of mental functions that are needed when going on automatic would either be not sufficient or be detrimental. You would do the wrong thing if you just went on automatic. The core executive functions are inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. And from those higher order executive functions are built like reasoning, problem solving, and planning. Inhibitory control is the ability to resist the strong inclination to do one thing and instead do what's most appropriate or needed. And there's several different kinds of inhibitory control. One kind of inhibitory control is at the level of attention, selective or focused attention. Paying attention despite distraction, inhibiting attention to what's not relevant and keeping your attention focused on what is relevant. Another aspect of inhibitory control is resisting the many temptations not to do your assignments or not to finish what you started. Maybe the big project you started has gotten boring by now, or maybe it's much harder than you thought, or maybe there's an interesting tangent that you'd much rather go off on instead of the project you originally picked. But you have the discipline to stay at it and finish it and see it through. Evidence shows that discipline accounts for over twice as much variation in final grades as does IQ, even in college. Self-control is the last of the three aspects of inhibitory control. It's being able to resist temptations, to think before you act, to not act impulsively. So a little child might resist grabbing another child's toy, or you resist getting in front of people in line. Or maybe there's an old friend that you haven't seen for years, and your first reaction on seeing this friend that you like so much is, my God, how much weight you gained. But you don't say that. You inhibit saying that and say something to make your friend feel good. So inhibitory control includes selective attention, discipline, and self-control. Children with less inhibitory control, that is, children who were less persistent, more impulsive, and had poorer attention regulation, as adults 30 years later have worse health, earn less, and commit more crimes than those with better inhibitory control as young children, controlling for everything under the sun: IQ, gender, social class, home lives, and family circumstances growing up. That's based on a study of 1,000 children born in the same city in the same year, followed for 32 years with a 96% retention rate. Unfortunately, I didn't do the study. The authors conclude that interventions that achieve even small improvements in inhibitory control for individuals could shift the entire distribution of outcomes in a salutary direction and yield large improvements in health, wealth, and crime rate for a nation. Working memory is holding information in mind while mentally working with it. That's critical for anything that unfolds over time, for that always requires holding in mind what happened earlier and relating that to what's happening now. So, of course, it's critical for understanding any spoken language, because you have to relate what you're hearing now to what you heard earlier. And it's critical for anything that you read, because you can't be looking at the whole thing at the same time. So you have to hold in mind what you read earlier and relate it to what you're reading now. It's crucial for mental math, for understanding cause and effect. Let's say you do something and somebody reacts. If you don't remember what you did, you don't know why you got that reaction. What did I do? Why are you acting that way? You have to remember. Cognitive flexibility is being able to easily and quickly switch perspectives or the focus of attention, flexibly adjusting to change demands or priorities, being able to think outside the box. So if one way of solving a problem isn't working, how can you think about the problem in a different way, think outside the box, so you can conceptualize it differently and be able to solve this, which nobody else has been able to solve before? It also involves flexibility. Maybe you were planning to do one thing, but an opportunity has arisen to do something else. Are you going to rigidly stay with what you were planning, or do you have the flexibility to take advantage of serendipity? Do you have the flexibility to admit when you were wrong when you get more information? An example of poor cognitive flexibility comes from Alexander Graham Bell. When one door closes, another door opens, but we often look so long and so regretfully upon the closed door that we do not see the ones which open for us. All of the above are executive functions or rely on them. Executive functions are more important for school readiness than IQ or entry-level reading or math. They're also important for school success. Working memory and inhibition each independently predict both math and reading competence throughout the school years, from preschool through university. Executive functions are critical for job success. Poor executive functions lead to poor productivity and difficulty finding and keeping a job. They're important for marital harmony. People with poor executive functions are more difficult to get along with, less dependable, more likely to act on impulse. And poor executive functions can lead to social problems like aggression, emotional outbursts, or crime. and early executive function gains can reduce the later incidence of aggression or antisocial behavior. Executive functions are core skills critical for cognitive, social, and psychological development, for mental and physical health, and for success in school and in life. And they depend on prefrontal cortex and the other neural regions with which prefrontal cortex is interconnected. Nowhere is the importance of social, emotional, and physical health for cognitive health more evident than with prefrontal cortex and executive functions. Prefrontal cortex and executive functions are the first to suffer, and suffer disproportionately if you're sad or stressed, lonely, or not physically fit. Our brains work better when we're not in a stressed emotional state, and that's particularly true for prefrontal cortex and executive functions. One reason for that is that even mild stress dramatically increases the neurotransmitter dopamine in prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex needs dopamine just like your car engine needs gasoline. But what happens if you flood your car engine with gasoline? Now it's not going to work properly. And it's the same thing if you flood prefrontal cortex with dopamine. It can't work properly. And mild stress only has that effect on prefrontal. It's not affecting any other brain region that way, even though these other brain regions have dopamine. In college students, 1 month of stress in preparation for a major exam disrupts prefrontal cortex functional connectivity. It also disrupts executive functions like attention shifting. The good news is that they recover. When you're sad, you're worse at selective attention. When you're happy, you're better at selective attention. People show more creativity when they're happy. The most heavily researched predictor of creativity in social psychology is mood. The most robust finding is that a happy mood leads to greater creativity. It enables people to work more flexibly and to see potential relatedness among unusual and atypical members of categories. Our brains work better when we're not feeling lonely or socially isolated, and that's particularly true for prefrontal cortex and executive functions. So an example of just a couple of studies. Roy Baumeister and colleagues told one group of subjects beforehand that they were likely to have close relationships throughout their lives. They told another group of subjects the opposite, and the third group of subjects unrelated bad news. On simple memorization questions that don't require executive functions, all three groups perform comparably. But on logical reasoning that requires executive functions, those told to expect that they'd be lonely perform worse. Other researchers haven't tried to manipulate that. They simply give out a little survey when you come into the lab. Do you feel socially supported? Do you feel lonely? And for example, one group found that prefrontal cortex works less efficiently in people who report that they feel lonely. Our brains work better when our bodies are physically fit, and that's particularly true for prefrontal cortex and executive functions. The brain doesn't recognize the same sharp division between cognitive and motor functioning that we impose in our thinking. The same or substantially overlapping brain systems subserve both cognitive and motor function. For example, the pre-supplementary motor area, the pre-SMA, is important for sequential tasks, and it doesn't matter whether they're sequential motor tasks or sequential cognitive tasks. Most cognitive tasks that activate dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the area I specialize in, also activate the cerebellum. And we didn't know this until we started doing fMRI. Me, meaning the entire scientific world, didn't know this. And one of the big surprises from fMRI research was to see the cerebellum activated for cognitive tasks. What on earth is this motor area doing when you need cognition and there's no motor component? Nobody understood. But when prefrontal cortex activation goes up, cerebellar activation goes up. When cerebellar activation goes down, prefrontal activation goes down. The activations in these two regions is strikingly correlated and closely coupled. Motor development and cognitive development appear to be fundamentally intertwined. When cognitive development is perturbed, as in a neurodevelopmental disorder, motor development is often adversely affected as well. So about half the kids diagnosed with ADHD or dyslexia or autism would fit the diagnosis for developmental coordination disorder. And about half the kids diagnosed with developmental coordination disorder would fit the diagnosis for ADHD, autism, or dyslexia. The cerebellum is smaller in children with ADHD and children with autism than in normal controls. Indeed, the largest difference in the brains of ADHD and non-ADHD children is not in prefrontal, it's not in the striatum, it's in the cerebellum. Children with ADHD show more sway when tested for balance than controlled children, either with their eyes closed or when on a foam pad. They have problems when they need to rely on vestibular input. Cognitive and motor skills obey the same laws and are acquired in fundamentally similar ways. One example out of the many I can give is training effects. Massed practice, where you practice the same thing over and over in a short period of time, gives you better immediate performance, but worse long-term performance. If you want the best long-term outcomes, you want space practice. Spread it out. Don't do it all in the same short period of time. And that's true whether you're doing motor learning or cognitive learning. Now remember, exercise alone appears not to be as effective in improving executive functions, at least in children, as exercise plus character development, martial arts, or exercise plus mindfulness, yoga. In a pilot study on yoga, girls 10 and 13 years of age were randomly assigned to yoga or physical training. The yoga training, which involved physical training, relaxation, and sensory awareness, improved performance on an executive function task called Tower of London, which requires all three core executive functions. And they were especially impaired the more difficult the condition of the task. Physical training, which was increased physical activity without any mindfulness component, produced no impairments in executive function. In reviews, what they've concluded is yoga interventions were equal or superior to exercise in nearly every outcome measured. In both healthy and diseased populations, yoga may be as effective or better than exercise at improving a variety of health-related outcome measures. Lakes and Hoyt did a wonderful study where they randomly assigned children in grades kindergarten through 5th grade to Taekwondo martial arts or standard phys ed. Children who had been assigned to Taekwondo training showed greater gains than children in standard phys ed on all dimensions of executive function they studied. Cognitive dimensions, like whether you're distractible or focused, affective dimensions, like whether you quit easily or you persevere. This generalized to multiple contexts and was found on multiple measures. They also improved more on mental math, which requires working memory. Science Magazine asked me to review all the interventions or programs for which there was empirical evidence that they improved executive functions. And it turns out there's a lot of different activities that improve executive functions, including computer games, computer training, aerobics, martial arts, yoga, mindfulness, and school curricula have all been shown to improve children's executive functions. Regardless of the intervention, a few principles hold. Those with initially poorest executive functions always gain the most. Since needy children often start school behind on executive functions, and since those with initially poorest executive functions gain the most, early executive function training is an excellent candidate for leveling the playing field and reducing the achievement gap and the health gap between more and less advantaged children. Children at risk start school with worse executive functions than more economically advantaged children and fall progressively farther behind each school year. Perhaps early executive function training could nip that dynamic in the bud. Small differences at the beginning can lead to bigger and bigger differences over time. Executive function computerized training transfers to new things never practiced, but the transfer is very narrow. So if you practice working memory, it improves working memory, but no other executive function. If you practice only spatial working memory, it improves spatial working memory, but not verbal working memory. So if you practice spatial working memory on X, you can also do better on spatial working memory on A, B, and C that you never practiced. But you're not better on anything else, like even the very closely related skill of verbal working memory. Executive function gains from training in traditional martial arts and in school curricula are wider, perhaps because the programs themselves address executive functions more globally, so the transfers may not actually be wider. It may just be that the training itself addresses more different kinds of executive functions. Consistently, the largest differences between intervention groups versus controls are found on the most demanding executive function conditions. Everybody does okay when executive function demands are moderate. Group differences are clearest when significant executive control is needed. You need to push the system to see a difference. Executive functions need to be continually challenged to see improvements, not just used, but challenged. Groups assigned to the same program, but without difficulty increasing, don't show the same gains. Setting aside a time to work on executive functions is less effective than working on executive functions as part and parcel of everything you do. And consistent with that, Erickson has looked at expert performance across many different domains, physical activity domains, cognitive domains, games, and he finds that what it takes to be an expert, to be really good at something, is countless hours of practice. In fact, he says 10,000 hours of practice, and practice to keep pushing your level of comfort and skill. Not practicing what you're able to do, but practicing just beyond what you feel you can do. Vygotsky talked about the same sort of thing. How can someone practice a skill he or she isn't yet capable of performing? And the answer is to scaffold. So here's an example of a dad scaffolding his daughter. She might not be able to cross the log over the river on her own, but with dad holding on, she can do it. So he's scaffolding her, he's supporting her, so that even though she couldn't do it completely on her own, with dad helping out, she can do it, and she can get practice. Scaffolds enable children to practice skills they would not otherwise be able to practice. Scaffolds thus help children get practice and the pride of having succeeded, and increasing confidence that they'll be able to succeed. And through repeated practice, they improve. The importance of repeated practice. Prefrontal cortex, the area I specialize in, is overrated. To learn something new, we need prefrontal cortex. But after something is no longer new, the people who perform best usually recruit prefrontal least. And this is an example from an early neuroimaging study in the mid-1990s. It's a task that requires prefrontal cortex, and some subjects activated prefrontal bilaterally. Some subjects activated it more on one side, some subjects more on the other side. And 2 subjects didn't activate it at all. This is Ruth Brigida and Kathy O'Craven, my colleagues, collaborators on the study. And because they were familiar with the test, prefrontal activation dropped out. And when we averaged them with all the other subjects, it reduced the size of our effect. When something is new, those who recruit prefrontal most usually perform best. But when you're really good at it, you're usually not using prefrontal so much. Older brain regions have had far longer to perfect their functioning. They can subserve task performance ever so much more efficiently than can prefrontal. A child may know intellectually, at the level of prefrontal, that he shouldn't hit another. But in the heat of the moment, if that knowledge hasn't become automatic, passed on from prefrontal to older brain regions, the child will hit another, even though if you ask the child, he knows perfectly well he shouldn't do it. It's the difference between knowing something at an intellectual level, at the level of prefrontal, and having it be second nature or automatic. The only way something becomes automatic, becomes passed off from prefrontal, is through action, repeated action. Nothing else will do. And Aristotle knew this in the 4th century BC. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. We don't act rightly because we have virtue or excellence, but we rather have these because we've acted rightly. These virtues are formed in a person by doing the actions. We are what we repeatedly do. Many activities not yet studied might well improve executive functions. It all depends on the way the activity is done and the amount of time spent doing it. The most important element is probably that the child really want to do it, so that he or she will spend a lot of time at it. It's the discipline, the practice, that produces the benefits. So we might as well have children do something they can put their heart and soul into. Now, that could be music. It could be playing a musical instrument. It could be orchestra. It could be sports. There are no studies of the value of sports for executive functions. There are studies of the value of aerobics for executive functions, but zero studies of the benefits of any sport for executive functions, unless you consider martial arts a sport. There's no studies of the benefits of nature, being in nature, gardening, orienteering in the woods. No studies of the benefits of dance. The National Dance Institute was founded in the mid-1970s by a remarkable ballet dancer named Jacques d'Amboise. He was the best male ballet dancer in the world for 3 decades. He was so good that the famous choreographer Balanchine choreographed ballets specifically for him. He was a high school dropout, a poor kid from a poor neighborhood headed for trouble. He happened to walk his sister to dance class one day, and the rest is history. So he figured if dance rescued him, maybe it could rescue other troubled kids. Before you leave, wait for the video. It's the next thing coming. So he founded the National Dance Institute, which has reached almost 500,000 kids. And there are lots of testimonials about how much it's helped kids, but there's no research data yet. We're hoping to get some. It's provided free to all the kids. So let me get the video. Improve executive functions, mental health, academic achievement. Another is circus. So I have a graduate student who just joined my lab this year, just entered graduate school, who dropped out of high school at age 14 to become a mime. And she studied mime with Marcel Marceau, was a professional mime, and then discovered circus and went into circus for several years. And for the last 12 years has been teaching in youth circus. It turns out, I didn't know, that in large cities all over North America, there's youth circuses, which work with at-risk kids and claim to transform their lives. But again, there's no data that it's to back it up. So she has come to my lab to try to do the scientific study to see if she can rigorously show what people say they see. And if you think about it, it makes some sense that it should improve executive functions. Certainly, you have to use your executive functions. You have to concentrate and stay focused. You're on the high wire. You don't want to lose your focus. It builds community. You learn to cooperate and trust others. If somebody's spotting you, you want to be able to trust that that person is not going to let you get hurt. And the kids love it. And, of course, it develops all kinds of physical skills: fitness, balance, coordination, strength, flexibility, aerobic capacity. This guy over here was born in prison. His dad was dead. His mother was in prison. By the age of 3, his mother was dead. At the age of 14, he was the oldest male in his family still alive who wasn't in prison. He discovered circus at the age of 8, and last year he entered university. Dance, sports, circus, martial arts challenge our executive functions, make us happy and proud, address our social needs, and help our bodies develop. These activities challenge executive functions. They require inhibitory control, selective attention, self-control, discipline, thinking before you act, working memory, cognitive flexibility, creatively thinking outside the box, flexibly adjusting to changed conditions. In a moment, you have to adjust to what's happening out there. They require serious discipline and perseverance. You have to practice, practice, practice. They're cognitively demanding. They sustain your attention. You have to hold complex sequences in mind. You learn a work ethic. To get good, the only way is practice, practice, practice. Through repeated experiences of not being able to do something, then trying really, really hard and being able to do it, you learn not to give up. And in sports or circus or all these others, you get that repeated experience. First, you think skill X is totally impossible. Then you try really hard and you're able to do X. Now the teacher says do 2x, and you think, there's no way I'm going to be able to do this. Then you keep trying, and miraculously you're able to do it. And you keep seeing that nothing's really impossible. If I keep trying, I can do it. It helps you come to believe in yourselves, to build pride and confidence. You see yourself succeeding. You see yourself conquering challenges, mastering what at first looked impossible. Samuel Proctor Macy said, "You'll never failed until you've tried for the last time, and you've never lost until you quit." He was a black man born in the deep, segregated South in the early 1900s. There's no question that he failed a lot, was set back a lot, experienced lots of discrimination. Yet he went on to be the first African-American professor at a U.S. Naval Academy. He was named one of the 6 best college chemistry professors in the U.S., one of the 75 premier chemists of the 20th century. His portrait hangs in the National Academy of Science, and a chair of excellence has been named in his honor. You've never failed until you've tried for the last time. You've never lost until you quit. Children need opportunities to do things that enable them to believe in themselves, doable challenges. Pride, self-confidence, and joy come from seeing yourself succeed at something that you know isn't easy. And sports, circus, all of these give you the opportunity to do that. Usually, if we hold children to high standards, they rise to them. This helps children come to believe in themselves, and our presenting such challenges affirms our belief that they can do it. If we don't let you try, you won't fail, but you never get the chance to win either. It's important to communicate loud and clear our faith in each child and the expectation that each child will succeed. Goethe said, "Treat people as if they were what they ought to be, and you help them become what they're capable of being." Psychology has shown over and over again the incredibly powerful effect of expectations, expectations that others have for you and the expectations that you have for yourself. For example, there's a very famous study called Pygmalion in the Classroom, done, I think, in the 1950s. It would never pass human subjects review now. Seriously, what they did is to give children in some school an IQ test, and then they misinformed the teachers intentionally about half the kids. Half the kids who had done really well on the IQ test, they said they had really low scores. And half the kids who had really low scores, they told the teacher they had really high scores. By the end of the school year, the kids were performing in line with what the teachers had been told, not in line with their actual scores at the beginning of the year. What we expect has a huge effect on what we see in the students. And then the expectations we have for ourselves. There are many examples of this. One example comes from social psychology in the area of what's called stereotype threat. There are lots of stereotypes in our culture. And one is that in general, women do less well in math than men in general. So researchers went to a university. They gave university students, like many of you guys, a standard math test. And lo and behold, as a group, the women students performed not as well as the men students. Then they went to another university, totally comparable group of students, gave exactly the same test. They only changed what they said before the test. They said this particular test has been designed to be gender neutral. On this particular test, women score as well as men. And what did they find? The women scored as well as the men. It was the same test. The only thing that changed is the women's expectations for themselves. The expectations you have for yourself are huge. Sports, martial arts, dance, circus improve your self-image, your self-esteem, your self-confidence for many reasons. You experience having courage. You experience not being so physically awkward anymore, moving with increased grace, learning to trust your body, increased self-confidence in using your body. Sports, dance, and circus provide great joy for the people involved. Happiness, joy, feelings of flow, of vitality. They reduce depression and anxiety. NDI, El Sistema, Youth Orchestra, and the 2 curricula I've shown to improve executive functions, which are called Tools of the Mind and Montessori. In all of those programs, embarrassment is extremely rare. No child is ever singled out or told they were wrong or scolded in public. Never happens. in all these programs, they're shared activities, they're group, ensemble, team activities, and that reduces social isolation and provides a sense of belonging. Children are part of a team, an ensemble of dancers or musicians. They learn to help one another, listen to one another, respect one another. Each is an important part of the whole. In a direct and sometimes high-risk way, they learn to trust one another. There's an increased sense of community, of experience being accepted by others, working toward a common shared goal. We're in this together. Over time, they get to know each other better, they share ideas, they share goals, and they're there for one another. And these experiences create bonds. They learn to cooperate, how to work with others. They come to see the value of collaborating and cooperating. Another characteristic of El Sistema, NDI, and Youth Circus is close mentoring relationships. I believe the greatest gift I can conceive of having from anyone is to be seen by them, heard by them, to be understood. Close mentoring relationships. The social, emotional, and cognitive aspects of physical activity are critically important. Physical activity is not only good for our bodies, it's good for our minds and our intellect, it's good for our emotions, and it's socially nourishing. To show the executive functions children are capable of, to achieve the academic outcomes that they're capable of, children need to feel joyful and unstressed. They need to feel they're valued members of a supportive community they can count on, and their bodies need to be fit and healthy. A hypothesis gaining support is that physical activity may be critical for achieving the outcomes we all want for our children. The different parts of the human being, cognitive, social, emotional, and physical, are fundamentally interrelated. Many different types of physical activity can address each and every one of those parts. If a child's emotional, social, or physical needs are unmet, those unmet needs will work against that child, showing as good executive functions as he or she can and doing as well in school as he or she can. Even if your goal is only to improve academic achievement, the best way to achieve that is not to focus narrowly on academics alone, but to address children's social and emotional development, as do the curricular-based programs that improve executive functions, and children's physical development, as do aerobics, martial arts, and yoga. Counterintuitively, the most efficient and effective strategy for advancing academic achievement is not to focus only on academics, but to nurture all aspects of the child. Thank you very much for your attention. Wow. Thank you. Thank you.
Can you take some questions? I'll let you.
Okay, I'll leave time for people who need to leave, and then there's time for discussion and questions.
So, if you have a question, there's a microphone right here. So those of you that want to interact for a short time here with some questions, please move towards the front. We have this microphone plus that one.
Hi.
There you go.
Dr. Diamond, thank you for your presentation. Many things I could say to you. I'll try to be brief. First, I'd like to thank you for that plug for the field of kinesiology, formerly known as, or inclusive of physical education, and in the broad sense before it became, seems to be today, focused a lot on exercise physiology. So thank you for that. Perhaps we can arrange for an honorary membership in the American Alliance for Health, Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance. You've covered a lot of ground in your career, and I first learned of your work a few years ago, where, and pardon me if my interpretation isn't accurate, but I sense that your work today really emphasizes the role of our activities in influencing the development of the brain, whether it be various physical forms of activity, mindfulness activities. I know you've had conversations with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, so I'm sure you've had discussions about the role of meditation in influencing prefrontal cortex. Am I correct that you're thinking more about how our various activities influence the brain, whereas earlier you might have thought about how brain maturation influences our activities?
Interesting question.
I tried to put it diplomatically.
I think I've always thought it was both. I've always been interested in genetic and neurochemical influences on prefrontal. I still am. And I've always been interested in environmental influences on prefrontal. Negative influences like poverty or stress, and positive influences like interventions. But you're absolutely right. My earliest work was looking at how brain maturation made possible certain cognitive changes. So that emphasized brain maturation more. So you're right. You're right. And now I'm much more interested in environmental interventions. Absolutely. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, I kind of have two questions. One's kind of based on the last half of your presentation, and the other one is based on kind of the first half. So I'll work backwards. Physical activity plays an integral role in increasing prefrontal function in children especially. So has anyone used this evidence to make an argument for physical activity in schools? And how has that progressed?
Unfortunately, school districts and state departments of education and the federal Department of Education is less evidence-based, are less evidence-based than you'd like. So people who are inclined in that direction will incorporate the evidence and preserve and increase physical activity. But most school districts are reducing the amount of time for physical activity because they're so incredibly worried about the exams at the end of the year and think incorrectly that the best way to get the best outcomes on those exams is to spend more time on academics. And so anything other than academics are considered frills and they're eliminated. The thing is, it sounds very intuitive that if what you care about are academic outcomes, you should spend the most time on academic instruction. But not everything that's logical is correct. And it seems that it's not the best way to get the best academic outcomes. It seems that the best way to get the best academic outcomes is to not have all the academic instruction, but to have more time for physical activity, play, and the arts. And some people are hearing that, but many people aren't. Frustrating.
Yes. I was learning about that in one of my other classes. And then my second question has to do with the physiological aspects of physical activity. You noted that aerobic activity had the most positive results for prefrontal cortex development, but what about the negative effects of overtraining? Has that been studied at all? Is there a limit at which point it becomes detrimental to brain development?
Well, first of all, the strongest effects for aerobic exercise are with adults and with older adults. So for development, as far as we have seen so far, things that go beyond just simply aerobics, but use the mind more, whether it's yoga or martial arts, seem to do better. Excuse me. There is evidence that overdoing it, exerting yourself too much is bad. It's bad in terms of your physical health, and it's bad in terms of exhausting your resources. So you don't have the resources to be able to do other things like cognitive tasks. So the golden mean is the way to go. You don't want too much and you don't want too little. Absolutely. Going once. Oh, go ahead.
I'm going to make an easy question, I think. So from what age can we start training kids on executive function? Is there an onset or we can start?
It's never too early and it's never too late. So you can train executive function in infancy. There are published papers showing that certain experiences improve executive functions by the age of 7 months. I've shown improvements by 10, 11, 12 months. And you also see improvements in people 80 or 90 years old through physical exercise in particular.
Thank you.